excited to see if all this stuff works. So hopefully you're in for the ride. Hi, so my name is Erin. I came here from Pittsburgh, specifically Google Pittsburgh is where I hang out, which I'm pretty sure is probably the first office you all think of when you think of big Google offices in the US, right? Yeah, me either. I work in Pittsburgh, and I hang out in a department called the Global News Initiative at Google, which does not deal with Google News, ironically, but deals with news publishers. But in my day job, I do lots of things with news. And in my free time, I like to travel, and I like to think about postcards. And I like to think about communication in all of its forms. And so I spent a really long time thinking about how hard it could be to send a postcard. And I want to walk you all through it. Spoiler alert, it's hard. So you might recognize this place. We're in Leeds. Maybe you traveled a few minutes, maybe you traveled a few days. It took me like 2 days to get here with a stop in the office in London. But I want to tell you about a previous trip that I took many years ago, 10 years ago, I guess, where I went to a beach in southern India with a friend of mine. And my friend Amit and I were sitting here, and it was very pretty. And I wanted to send a postcard. Now, of course, that meant going to like a tourist bureau and finding a postcard and then figuring out who sells stamps and then figuring out where the post office is or what have you. But I also had done a little bit of art while we were there, and I had taken some photos. And so here's something I did while we were waiting at the train station, because this was 2015, so photo editing on the iPad wasn't as cool as it is now. And so I was just experimenting to see how far I could push it. Or then we were at this amazing salt flat, the Great Run of Kutch. And I have another version of this that looks like we're on Tatooine because it's got the two suns rising, of course. So it's I wanted my art to be the postcards. I didn't just want to show that I had been somewhere. So I said, okay, well, let's find where the nearest post office is, right? And it's not that far away, right? It was only about 1.5 miles. I didn't understand the public transportation here, so I just took a walk and ended up here. And I looked at this and I said, well, this is where Google Maps says the postcard or the post office is, but it's not here, right? And it's not that mailbox, it's this alleyway. This alleyway is the street address, and you go down this alleyway, and behind this alleyway is a very small place that is actually legitimately a post office. And so I was able to get stamps, and it was wonderful, but man, did that take a long time, and it was difficult. And so I've been thinking about that for many, many years. But before I get into that, I want to kind of tell you how I ended up thinking about all this technology in this particular way. So let's talk about an origin story, like all good stories have. So here I am working at a convenience store / pharmacy, right? Always have to have your fun minimum wage job to start. Although at my minimum wage job, I also brought a laptop and taught myself how to program in PHP, because it was that little business there. And you can see, cigarettes cost nothing. So clearly this was many, many years ago. Although, right, you can all identify the titanium 867 PowerBook, right? So that also kind of gates it as to when this was probably. Eventually I stopped working in convenience stores and became a technical illustrator of all things. And I have a whole portfolio of shampoo bottles, right? Because that's normal. I really love drawing transparent things. Like you can see the one on the left, there's just an amazing detail up there with, is this gonna happen? No, okay. It doesn't matter. It's transparent, right? Then my brother and I lived in an apartment in Brooklyn for many years, and we internet-enabled our door before that was a thing. And Fast Company and Gizmodo and everybody wrote up about the crazy viral video that we made around internet-enabling our front door, specifically with Foursquare, which was great, because we all use Foursquare these days, right? Yeah. Fun story, we actually became the top 5 users of the Foursquare API during this project because we pulled it. They had no push API, and so we just abused it until they made a push API. And the two founders were friends, so that was an okay thing to do. But I also hung out at the Wall Street Journal for a while, where I had the privilege of working on the first and subsequent 6 years versions of iPad apps for news. And we were definitely not the first publisher that Apple called, but we were one of the first. And it was a fun project and got me really thinking about design and the user experience and what it actually meant to hang out on an iPad. Then I hung out at the New York Times. See how I said I like news, right? And at the New York Times, I did not work on news. I worked on games and real estate and watching and cooking and all the things that weren't news. We got to do other things like Android Instant Apps. You guys have all used an Android Instant App, right? It's like an app clip, except for Android. For real. And so now I'm here at Google, unrelated to having done the Android Instant App stuff. But none of this is relevant to the story today. This is all just background, right? What's really relevant is adjacent to almost all of that, I also taught. And I taught at 2 universities in the US. One is Cooper Union, and the other is Yale. Cooper Union is noteworthy because it doesn't cost anything, which is very unusual for the US. But I taught a series of bizarre classes for 12 or 14 years there that were specifically trying to enable designers to understand the internet as an artistic medium. So it's not teach designers how to code, right? It was more teach designers how to think from a system standpoint about the APIs and experiences that we have. And I had a couple of foundational tenets that I used for all of the projects that I worked on with the students there, right? I wasn't going to teach them a thing to do. What I was going to do is teach them how to learn to do, to teach themselves. Because as you all know, APIs change, right? Last 2 months ago, what year is it? 6 months ago, we weren't thinking that we were going to be really excited about liquid glass, and now that's a new thing we have to learn, right? It doesn't mean that we failed in not learning it 6 months ago. We have to learn how to adapt and how to adjust. I also, because the school is free, doesn't mean that the students have money to spend, right? It means that all students of all levels of access come there. So I wanted to make sure that everything cost as little or as free as possible. And so I practiced that a lot. I also always felt like my classes, at least the first couple of them every semester, were a pitch. It was my job to convince the students that they should stay and take this job, or take this class, sorry. And so I wanted to make everything as tangible as possible, as quickly as possible. Reduce the time to interest into 0, effectively, because the quicker they see it's fun, the more engaged they're going to be, and then the easier time I have. And I also have to always remind myself that all of these students came to these classes from a different perspective. Some of them had been programming for years. Some of them had never thought about a folder, right? Because that's a thing that people don't even think about these days. And so through these classes, one of the things that we would develop would be a topic list. And so a sample set of topics would be, normal things for a design class, like Hawaiian missile alerts or time as a critical component or citizen science, right? And it was a lot to look at these lists, so eventually I decided to graph the list and say, like, all right, well, maybe it's really about, like, there's a practical and an impractical axis, and there's a beneficial or malicious axis. And over time, honestly, we started talking more and more about malice because it seemed relevant. But it's in this liminal space where I like to hang out, right? This area that is maybe beneficial, but also not really useful for anything. And so I've spent a lot of time hanging out here to the point where last year I incorporated a company called Happy Tech. And I'm sure you all have heard of the source material that Happy Tech is from, because it is the name of your employer in the Douglas Adams authored text adventure from the mid-'80s called Bureaucracy. And Bureaucracy is about bureaucracy. And this is a screencast of a part of the game where a person is exploring a bank, and they have to figure out how to get money out of the bank, but only the deposit window is open, and they only have deposit slips, but you need a withdrawal because you have to pay for something. And I'm going to spoil this game from 40 years ago. You have to submit a withdrawal, or you have to submit a deposit slip with a negative amount, and then you get money. Anyways, Bureaucracy was a phenomenal game and extremely important in my history, right? And when you bought the game, it came with, these were called feelies, I think, right? Like physical assets to remind you that you are entering this, digital world. And of course, Douglas Adams was a great author, so all of this was hilarious. And it was all also used against you. The forum on the right that had a digital version when you boot up the game. And every question, every answer you give is used against you later on in the game. For example, everything that is your least favorite color, that color comes up all the time. Or your last but one significant other, leaves you nasty voicemails. So this was a great thing for a 7-year-old to discover. And so I did. And so I thought this was great source material to really focus on building a company around. When I made the logo for it, I didn't want to make a logo for Happy Tech. I wanted to make an algorithm as the logo, and the logo is just a current manifestation of it. Over time, that became having to build an app to support this so that I could randomly generate these logos at any time, and then made it touch sensitive, and all the things that we do with apps, right? And so I have this company, and it has a website, and it kind of looks like a technical paper, and there's nothing there. And I've made 2 apps under this company. The first one is called Wish You Were Here, which we're going to spend some time talking about. And the second one is called Letterset. And these apps are very niche. And they're, in my opinion, technically complex and well done from their complexity standpoint. But that doesn't mean that I think that they're actually broadly useful, because that's not the point, right? Remember, it was in the questionable area of utility. But so let's take a look at Wish You Were Here, which is a postcard sending application. There are lots of postcard sending applications. There's millions of them if you look in the app store, so I haven't even tried to compete for search dollars there. But mine does the things you would expect a postcard app to do, at least at first, right? You start by selecting a contact, which is, of course, the first point of friction that I lose every user to, because you have to choose your address from a contact. There's no form to fill out. And I do that for emotional reasons, because I want people to use the contact's address book. Same thing when you're actually composing a postcard. You have to choose from your contacts. And a show of hands, how many of you maintain all of your friends with their actual physical mailing addresses in your contacts? More than 0. Nice job. I see I have at least 3 more users. You select a photo, great. You select a photo, right? And then you immediately preview and see the postcard. You start writing in the postcard. When you're authoring in the postcard, there's a couple of fonts that you can choose from, and the only interesting thing here is that I'm using a fun attributed string to render all of this, because whenever you use an emoji, I dynamically swap it out with the Noto emoji, black and white rendered version of that. And so the string is awful to manage and really fun to look at. There's location data in it, but I don't need to request your user permissions for location, because I'm not asking for your info. I'm asking for the photo's info. And so if the photo has embedded EXIF GPS data, I use it, and then I feed that into MapKit, and then I display you places that are near it, and then you can choose from those and have that attributed on the postcard, and then you can send it. Seems reasonable so far, right? This is what every other postcard app does. One of the things you might notice is that there's not really a lot of customization along this path, right? There are some fonts that you can choose from, and there's a whole bunch of other weird customization stuff. But nevertheless, let's talk about what it actually takes to send a postcard with this app, right? We're going to talk about having an API strategy, thinking through business models, learning how to automate everything, and also learning how to share, which of course is something I talk to my kids about every day. By the way, when I submitted my talk, I want to submit a correction. When I submitted this talk, I said that I had a 8 and 6-year-old. That's out of date. I have a 7 and 9-year-old. Anyways, so what's an API? These 2 people are perfectly representing an API, right? An API is just a way of defining the contract of discussing things between 2 people. Maybe the cat here is an impartial third party. I don't know. But when I work with APIs with my students, one of the challenges that we have is that they always stop working. And I don't mean like downtime. I mean like fundamentally, when you're talking about decades, right? Things stop working. And usually it's for business reasons and not because of an actual use case. Let's talk about weather for a second. That's a new topic for today. So one of the first things I always teach my students is how to use the Weather Underground API, because it's a great way to see things immediately change on screen, right? Every time you refresh, you can get a new piece of weather information. And so, they're doing web things. They're very excited. Oh, wait, Weather Underground was bought by weather.com, and then that was bought by IBM. And so then IBM shut it down. Fun story, they also just sold it again 2 years ago. So every project that my students did previously that used the Weather Underground API no longer works. Then I said, all right, well, let's migrate to dark sky. That was a good decision, right? For those of you who aren't as plugged in, Dark Sky was then bought by Apple, and Apple actually did a nice thing where they left the API up for quite a while. I don't actually know if it's still up. I'm pretty sure it's not. And so Dark Sky also gone, right? So what I'm trying to say is weather APIs and using weather products kind of risky in terms of their long-term utility, right? So I'm watching Chris. Got to make sure that this weather app stays working. Anyways, so it's not just the weather, right? We would do all sorts of weird projects using any API that would exist, right? And so we would do amazing things with Twitter. Wait, no, not Twitter anymore. We would do things with Instagram. No, Instagram decided to have an ad unit. They shut that down. Facebook, of course, decided that their graph was actually very valuable, and so they don't want you to do it. But I'm not just being critical here of APIs and their business models that companies use to make them, because that's a fine thing to do. It just sucks to build things on top of it and have them stop to work. But it's not just the APIs. We also experience this in the web ecosystem in general, and of course also in apps. I'm aware we're here to talk about apps, don't worry. Glitch, which was a phenomenal way of making and hosting free websites, free or cheap websites, shut down earlier this year for reasonable reasons. And so not only have the APIs stopped working, but all of the ways of students hosting their projects. So every project that was hosted, even if it was built against APIs that still work, no longer function. And of course, even the browsers do this, right? Chrome here recently deprecated Manifest v2 for browser extensions. And browser extensions were one of the things that we would build projects for. Now, none of my students were using APIs that were not compatible with v3, but that's beside the point. The point is only to just talk about the crazy, sand pit that all of this stuff is built on top of. And then there's Flickr, right? And Flickr we all use every day still. Flickr, has been through insanity, right? It was bought by Yahoo, it was bought by Verizon, and then maybe AOL and somebody else, and now it's owned by SmugMug. And amazingly, Flickr's API still works. It is the only API that continues to function the way that my students' projects would have expected, although, of course, since all their projects were on Glitch, none of them work. But they can download that code and use it. So fine, great. What's the solution? Well, obviously, let's all be Flickr, right? This is the solution. No, it's not. That's not really reasonable. They also have like first mover advantage. I don't know if you know their history, but they basically co-authored OAuth as a specification, right? They had a thing called FlickrAuth, and it basically evolved into OAuth. So they've been thinking about APIs in the right way for a very long time. But what we can learn from this is say like, all right, well, if I have to build against APIs, because obviously I'm not going to be printing postcards, right? I'm going to be using print fulfillment companies to make postcards. So at a bare minimum, what I can do is protect myself from the fact that one of these print companies might decide they're not going to do print anymore, they're just going to do NFTs or some other interesting pivot. Maybe there's, yeah. Okay. So, just graphing out that last chart, it's like, okay, so I have an endpoint to render a postcard. When it comes in, the server looks at the data and determines what type of renderer should be used for it. And these are kind of split by size, destination, and media type, company. Now, unfortunately, the APIs that I use are all, when they refer to domestic, they refer to United States. Please just think about that when seeing these slides. But so the actual lesson here, right, and the first of a few lessons that we want to talk about is that even if you're using your own APIs, you should still abstract them away from yourself to protect yourself from yourself in the future. So when I build my APIs for the postcard project, I have it set up like that, right? I have like an abstract renderer on the server that can take a configuration that then gets passed to one of many renderers. And it's one of those things where I like to think about it so that it's over-engineered for the future, where maybe I could do, if you're sending a postcard from point A to point B, that I could partner with a print company in point B and save on the shipping and also speed it up because it's just on demand in that location. Fine. Anyways. Protect yourself from your own APIs. As I said in the app, I have to accept payment somehow, right? You are paying for a postcard. It is an actual physical postcard that is being mailed. It's not a digital thing. In fact, there's no way of getting your digital postcards out of the app purposefully, right? The only experience you have with it is you author it digitally, and then it goes into the real world, and then a week later, or like 20 days later, depending on where you're sending it, you get a text from a friend that says, I got your postcard, that's so cool. That's the only way you get it digitally. So I need to accept payments. There's a few different ways of doing that, right? You can use third-party providers, you can use credit card processors, you can use Apple in-app payments, what have you, right? Each of them have their own pros and cons, but they all ultimately do the same thing, right? They take money from somebody else, and eventually they give you some of it. I'm going to talk mostly about Lob here, because this is the company that I'm currently using for most things, right? And I'm going to show real dollars, but I want to be really clear. I make so little money in this case, and we'll actually see how little money I make. But I want you to understand how it works and the choices that go into it, right? So Lob is 87 cents for a postcard, which includes printing and shipping in the US. They add, I think, 50 cents additional if it's being sent internationally, which is, again, anywhere that's not the US. And it's a flat fee. And it's an okay quality, right? It's fine. Let's take a look at their business model. So graphing the cost of their postcards, one of the things they do is there's a developer account which you can use for free, which has the 87-cent postcard. But then if you choose to pay in advance, the cost goes down on a per postcard unit. But of course, there's a threshold. You don't immediately want to go and pay the highest amount if you're sending no postcards. So there's pretty big cliffs. When you get to about 1,000 postcards a month, it becomes actually worth it to pay the $260 for that level of account. And when you get to 3,500 postcards a month, you get to 58 cents a postcard, right? So you can do it much cheaper if you start to get to scale. Just to be clear, I'm not at either of those levels. So how does that actually break down? Well, so I wanted to start to price this and said, all right, well, let's look at a 99-cent postcard, because everybody in the App Store is way higher than that, at least in the US. I can't speak for prices elsewhere. So if you look at a 99-cent postcard, and my fantasy was to use Apple in-app purchases because of reasons, which we'll talk about. So I wanted to use an in-app purchase, and so here's the first estimates, right? We've got a 99-cent purchase. Then we take 15 cents off for Apple's 15% fee, because of course this company is earning less than $1 million in revenue. And then you take the postcard fee, and then I've spent 2 cents to send this postcard, right? I make less than zero. So that's not great. If I charge $1.99, which of course is the next increment that Apple will let you charge, it gets it to be a little bit better, right? And now I'm making 82 cents a postcard. Fine, right? If you zoom out and you say, like, here's a on-demand print fulfillment business that makes almost 100% margin, like, great. Now let's look at a credit card processor instead of Apple. And credit card processors, you would think, are cheaper because instead of charging 15%, they charge 3.5%. But that's not really true, because they charge 3.5%, but then they have a minimum transaction fee, which generally is around 30 cents. And it can be less if you negotiate or you get an onboarding deal with Stripe or somebody. But you can see right off the bat, I'm making even less money, because previously I was making 2 cents less. Now I'm making 36 cents less. And if we charge $2, okay, now I'm making 75 cents, right? And there's a certain point where going the credit card route obviously is more valuable to you if you're focused exclusively on percentage of revenue returned, which is the point. And you look at these two things and you say, like, on the left we have a credit card and we're charging $2 and we get 75 cents, and on the right we have an in-app purchase and we get 82 cents, right? It's not really that easy to choose between these two. Obviously the right is slightly better, but what else is going on? So you graph this over time, and you look at all 4 possibilities where you're going with, in this case, Lob or direct mailers, and I'm comparing their credit card processing fees at the various different discount levels and the in-app purchase fees at those various discount levels, and it's basically the same. Like if you were to take this chart and say, like, well, we went with the bottom row, it's fine, right? It's still up and to the right. Isn't that the direction these charts are supposed to go? I don't know. So if we look at these fees, we look at the choice, right? If it's all the same in terms of the actual revenue, what are the actual things that we're deciding on, right? And so if we go with in-app purchase, obviously we're subject to Apple's rules about in-app purchases. There's limited flexibility in terms of where and how you can sell it. You don't necessarily get to own the customer in the same way that you would with a different custom flow. Because technically you don't even need to know about the customer. You just know that you've received money and then you can do something with it. But it's basically more affordable, especially for the low cost transactions. And credit cards, of course, give you infinite flexibility, but it really only becomes cost effective when you're talking about a $6 or more transaction. Now, before I continue, I know you're all really excited to go over technical documents with me, so let's take a look at my favorite RFC, RFC 2119, which of course is the one that defines these words. You've probably seen this a million times when you look at a technical document. This RFC is the one that describes the words could, or should, must not, required, shall, et cetera, et cetera. And so what's of note in this is my favorite of these words, which is the word may. And the thing about may, and we can just hide all the stuff so you can see the important part, right, is if you see the word may in a technical document that conforms to RFC 2119, it's truly optional, right? And that means that it happens or not. I mean, I don't need to tell you all about optionals. So let's take a look at Apple's App Store review guidelines. It's going to take us a little while to get through this. So if we start with section 1, I'm sorry, let's just fast forward. So in section 3.1.3 E, I think, right? Or one of them, right? There's this unfortunate clause, right, which says that if your app enables people to purchase physical goods, you must use a method other than in-app purchase. Well, that means I'm out of luck, right? Because obviously my postcard is a physical good, and therefore this exception exists, and this exception exists, of course, for companies like Amazon, who need to sell things in the app but don't want to provide a revenue cut, which is very reasonable. However, because I read these things all the time, one of the things I noticed is this amazing other exception, part of 3.1.1, which talks about gift cards. And there's this note here that says physical gift cards that are sold within an app and mailed may use a form of payment other than in-app purchase. Are you guys following me? Right? So if you may use a form of payment other than in-app purchase, you also may not, right? So tenet number 2, purposefully misread developer guidelines. That's not true, right? But what I mean by that, though, is, and by the way, I put this in here so you can read it at some point later. This is how I described my app to the App Store Review Committee when I went in. And I went into a lot of detail about the absurdity of the business model and how I was exclusively limiting it to the iOS world. As my website says, it got approved, and so now it exists. And so this absurd, purposeful negation of the word may in a document which Apple doesn't purport that their document conforms to RFC 2119, but most documents like it do. And so I felt like it was fair to interpret it through that lens. It worked. And so I have this app that lets you use in-app purchases to purchase a physical good. Or does it? I don't know. But yeah, so that's the actual takeaway number 2, is explain your business model, right? I met with the App Store review team 3 times, I think, before I actually submitted the app in the WWDC open office hours. And each time I explained it, and each time they said, there's like a field where you can put additional info, just like give us a whole presentation on this. And I was like, oh, I like presentations. Anyways, let's move on. So I'm a solo developer on this. I do have 2 people that help me every now and then, and I'm very thankful for their efforts, but that's been mostly limited to server stuff. One of the challenges I have with these apps is that I can't actually work on it all the time or every day, right? I have a job, I have kids, I have things in life, right? So here's a lovely server that I used to maintain. Clearly you can see I'm very good at server maintenance. And my systems can't be like this for when I'm working on these APIs. So one of the things I've spent a huge amount of time on is making it so I can forget about all of the junk that happens downstream from me writing code. And so Xcode Cloud is a great starting point for that, right? I trigger all of my, everything I do goes through Xcode Cloud. I basically can run locally, and then everything else goes away. You have various different hooks so that if you have a pull request, it can make a test flight build just for me, for a limited internal audience. If I do a release, it creates an external build automatically for my external testers. Oh, here's the internal one. Sorry, here's the external one. And then from the release, you can go and do a manual App Store review. And of course, this is not unique to Xcode, right? Fastlane, everything else. also does this fun stuff, right? But per my previous statement, this is free, right? We're already paying for this effectively because we have to have our Apple developer account every year, so you might as well use it. And so I use the free stuff. But in addition to all of this, I also want to think about how this actually helps my app development philosophy. It's not just can I build the thing, right? But it's can I use the features to my own advantage. And so when you're setting up your app, your Xcode build things, Xcode Cloud build workflows. Sorry, I can do this. You can do things like set environmental variables, right? And that's great. And we can use those environmental variables. And now here's where we actually look at some real code. And I will not say that any of this code is worth copying, but the ideas and the end result of it are the point. So one of the things you can do with Xcode Cloud is you have a CI post clone script, which lets you do things with your build, with your code before, during, or after you've done a build. So one of the things I have in my CI post clone script is things to help me when I'm testing the app understand where the app is being tested. Was this build from Xcode just for me? Was this build for my trusted testers? Was this a public build? Right? All of that gets directly flighted into the files using these various different features. In addition to that, then of course I have helper libraries in the app that then read these features. Now, I was thinking about it when I was making this slide that it's funny that this is an observable class that stores this information when clearly it's only being changed at build time. Like that's not a thing that changes. But nevertheless, there it is. And so I set up CI and CD for every Xcode thing that I do because that way I don't ever need to think about it. I just build code locally, submit a pull request to myself, or maybe some AI agent in the future when they actually understand things, and then continue. Sorry, that's not a slight against AI agents. That's a slight against the speed that Apple develops new SDKs and APIs, because as you all know, or maybe you don't, one of the challenges with agents is they're trained at some point in the past. And then Apple's like, here's some new APIs. And the agents are like, I don't know what that is. Anyways, so I do the same thing for my websites, the actual APIs behind the scenes, right? In GitHub, I use GitHub Actions. Actually, that's not true. I do a combination of things. Sometimes, if it's like for the simple parts of the site, like the actual end-user-facing website, that I'm using GitHub Actions for. If it's the APIs, then I do things in a much more involved way, which is just a normal suite of microservices that you would build for fun in your free time on Amazon, right? This is a normal thing to do. So here's like one of my pipelines. And of course, at this point now I have ephemeral pull request builds so that when I do a pull request, it creates an entire new stack just for me to test. And the app lets me configure it to hit that. And totally normal things to do for fun, right? So CI/CD first and always, all of the things, right? Website, apps, APIs, also packages, although Xcode Cloud doesn't build packages by itself. Still with me? Okay. So speaking of OpenAPI, let's not talk about OpenAPI. One of the things that I like about OpenAPI is that, especially with our iOS or Apple ecosystem apps, we don't really need to think about it as the REST API. Like, I love Swift OpenAPI Generator, and I use it all the time. There's a great talk earlier today that you might have seen that talks about it. But what's also cool about it is that beyond just being able to generate these clients for dealing with client-server interoperability, you also get lovely things like types, right? So when you're going in here and you're actually defining things, like the paths for viewing a postcard and getting a preview response, you can see here I'm also referencing, maybe you can't see, sorry. I'm referencing postcard envelope preview and postcard API error, right, to types. And of course, there's type definitions that go along with those. Sorry, here's the type definitions. And the type definitions continue, and here's some more, and here's some more, right? And you just define these in the OpenAPI spec, and then you run it through the Swift OpenAPI generator, and then you basically have a client that can understand all of these types and respects their data type and optionality and all that other fun stuff. And then what I like to do is, speaking of Swift argument parser, is I combine that with Swift Open API Generator so that I can use a CLI to test and abuse my own APIs to make sure that they're functioning properly. So in addition to my API client, I also have a target for building a command line executable, which works pretty well, and of course just speaks to and uses the same types that everything else does. Or sorry, in this case it's methods, and those methods then communicate using the types that are defined. So in this case we have postcard envelope preview, which was one of the types that we were seeing previously, and that's basically the representation of the postcard that is created by the server during the preview step, because in my flow, you send the payload to the server to validate that everything's functioning and that you're sending it from a reasonable client. And then afterwards, you submit a send request. And in addition to that, of course, because I have web services, and because I started on this before I started thinking about Swift on the server, my APIs are not written in Swift. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. They're written in JavaScript, not even TypeScript, just Node, JavaScript. But I can still use type definitions from the same OpenAPI document to use and then mash my client and server responses against, which is really, really great. So like here's the type definition that matches the other one. If you want to know more about this, there's a great talk that I can recommend for you. But so there's some really great things to take advantage of when sharing your types. You make it so that your client and server can understand each other, which is kind of an important thing. And then we're all happy. So we're getting there. Now we're talking about replying. And replying is a weird thing because, show of hands, how many of you have ever replied to a postcard with another postcard? One. Nice. That's much more than I was expecting. Now this is a letter that I received many, many years ago from my grandmother. She lived in the middle of France and she had a typewriter and she would always type me letters. And so I've always been in love with, the aesthetic of crazy letters like this. But let's go back for a second. Remember this amazing slide that we were looking at before, May, right? There's the part of this that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about, which is physical gift cards. What's a physical gift card? Well, I'm sending a physical card, right? This is a physical card that gets sent in the mail, but how do we turn it into a gift card? Any guesses? Correct, app clips. So my bright idea was, well, what if I shoehorn in an app clip onto the gift card, onto the postcard, and that app clip carries an entitlement with it. And that entitlement is then useful behind the scenes to act as an entitlement that the recipient who has received the postcard in the mail can use to exchange for goods or services. That sounds like a gift card, right? And Apple agreed. And so if you look at the user flow, right, we select a contact, we select a photo, we send a postcard, and everybody's happy. And then afterwards, we have a totally divorced set of APIs and mechanisms, which is now the recipient. The recipient receives the postcard and has to go through a completely different flow. The fun thing about the separation of these with create and reply is that the reply feature can be really, really quick because you don't need to enter a to or from address because it's just the inverse of the information that came in the first place. So when you reply, you just select a photo, write a message, and hit send. There's no payment because the person who has sent the postcard in the first place has already used the in-app purchase mechanism, which I've priced to accommodate both sides of the transaction. So this is great. Let's use an app clip. Well, circular app clips look cool, but they hold less information. They're hard to generate on the server, and they're pretty, I guess. You can color scheme them, right? QR codes are ugly, but they work all the time. Let's use a QR code. Apple has a way of using the advanced app clips experience, which lets you use a QR code, assuming that you have a domain, and assuming you have the domain set up to be a well-known domain with files that say that and configure it. And so now we have this QR code, which is also an app clip code. And so now a recipient who receives this postcard in the mail can scan this QR code, which conveniently says, well, this is the internal server, right? See my previous topic on splitting by environments and doing things there. So underneath the QR code, it says all the app debug information that I need. And the cool thing is that's also all submitted to the postcard fulfillment vendor, so I can do traceback from any fulfillment problems. Anyways, so this is a QR code. So the user scans it, and then an app clip opens, which is weird because nobody understands what an app clip is, especially people who receive postcards in the mail. So that's fine. That's what I want, right? Remember the circle of questionable utility? There's also a third type of app clip codes, which is NFCs. How many of you have used an NFC app clip? Wow, one. I've never come across one. So I'm sure they have features and they do things. I can't tell you about them. So we're not going to talk about them. But like I said, you have to set up server configurations to say that at a specific location, this is a well-known configuration. Here's the package that it's tied to. Here's the routes that I'm supporting or saying don't load an app clip for. All of the fun things that normal people think about. And then in your app, you create a new target, right? In this case, it's called my reply app, and then you handle the URL redirect. So the app clip, the QR code itself is just a URL. But because Apple knows that that URL has a well-known configuration and then looks at the path, then it can choose to selectively open up your app using this invocation. And so then you get a web page URL, and you can have your app respond in a completely different way. Or if it's the app clip build, it only knows how to respond to things like that. Now, of course, there's still constraints. It's not all roses, right? App clips have to be really, really limited in file size. And so, for example, you can't have infinite numbers of fonts embedded in them because those take up a lot of space. And also, users are anonymous for the most part, right? We haven't talked about login systems or authentication because there isn't any. And there's all sorts of ways of dealing with this in my system, but I don't care about users or returning or push notifications or email addresses, right? The only metric I look at is, has somebody sent a postcard? And so there's ways of dealing with this, like you can use this clever workaround to kind of use iCloud, but not really, to get a unique identifier. You can use Apple's really official way of doing app attestation to say, like, is this request really coming from a real device? And all that's wonderful. And then when you're doing testing in Xcode, there's an app clip URL invocation setting, which you can use to launch your app into app clip mode so that it's a little bit easier to test. Now, of course, keeping track of these is really annoying, especially when the fact that all these URLs are real URLs for me that have entitlements behind the scenes. And so after I'm done testing one of these, I have to regenerate a new URL. And there's lots of great articles on this, which will be in the footnotes of this whenever you can download this presentation. In addition to that, in addition to testing in Xcode using app clip URLs and invocations, I can't emphasize enough how much the integration testing is important for this because, of course, it's all APIs all the way down. And so in my API client library, where we saw the CLI and Swift Open API generator, we also have the battery of tests that have to run all the time before any of these changes are allowed to go through. And these are real integration tests that are hitting any one of my environments, either local or any of the servers. That repeated twice. Great. Integration tests are your friends when you're using APIs, be it yours or somebody else's. I know we always talk about unit tests and functional tests, but I love integration tests, don't you? All right. So I'm going to leave you here. I think you know everything about my app. We've seen a few snippets of code, right? But really, we understand a little bit more about the ecosystem of the postcards, of the way that apps, app clips, Xcode, Xcode Cloud, environments, and all the like fit together. But rather than give you a parting thought to think through, I want to give you all an assignment because you're all just the class, right? So I have one assignment for you all, which is make something that lasts, right? It's not as easy as you would think. And it's part of why I love thinking about APIs first, because you can put so much effort into the design of the types and the design of the interfaces. And when I say APIs here, of course, I'm meaning things that are not GraphQL and things like that, because that's kind of the antithesis of designing first, right? That's like, here's everything, figure it out, which is fine. There's lots of times where that's useful. I love thinking about the utility and longevity of the APIs. See previous conversation about Flickr. I love thinking about the physical manifestation of weird digital assets. And I also just love art and postcard art in general. I've been surrounded by, these are pictures from my parents' house where these were artistic postcards that friends made. And I was just always surrounded by these. Like we've had so much art in the house and postcard art in general. And there's also weird media around this, like books that specifically focus on art, male art, right? And all these things. And so make something that lasts. Here's some postcards. I hope you have learned how hard it can be to send a postcard. And before we leave, I have postcards for all of you. And so I'm going to pass them out now while we wait for negative time for questions.